Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. So we're 1 week away from Trump's next deadline in his seemingly endless game of hokey cokey, bouncing between deadlines and pauses after Japan and the US agreed terms. All eyes are on the EU next, who have presented Trump with proposals, but have also teed up some aggressive counter moves if he doesn't accept them, including a huge nuclear trade option, which would have Trump's tech bros sweating. So what are the EU offering Trump and what are they threatening him with? But first, for daily news and politics, please click the subscribe button to stay notified. So the first thing to point out is that the EU are clearly not expecting Trump to understand why the United States has the largest economy or the extra benefits of holding the world's reserve currency. As such, they're clearly having to work on the basis of Trump's understanding of trade. And Trump's understanding of trade, or misunderstanding really, is that the EU are somehow doing better than the US based on just the export and import figures. And when it comes to those figures, the EU does export more to the US than it imports, hence Trump wanting to levy large tariffs against them. The EU could, of course, apply counter tariffs, which would definitely hurt key Republicans. They are well practiced at doing that against Republican presidents who don't understand trade or the EU, going back to like W. Bush. But there are complications this time. Since COVID and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Europe not only has a much greater need for investment, but we're all facing hitherto unusual economic constraints. And given how little Trump understands trade, but also how poor his capacity for learning is, if the EU cannot be sure that a trade war would bring him to heel before it does too much collateral damage, then that would just compound the problems. There is another complication attached to the war in Ukraine as well. Europe has realised that we have to look to our own defences. We finally realised what America has been hinting at for basically a decade now, before Trump even. The USA has got more interest in Asia than Europe. But it will take time to build up our own defences, and in the meantime, kind of need the USA on side still. So even if Trump cannot see the global trade picture, the EU can. Trump's support for Ukraine, albeit reluctant, has a value. That value can be offset against his tariffs to a degree. But obviously 30% tariffs, which is what Trump is threatening against the EU, are completely out of the question. That would, to all intents and purposes, kill off trade. It's why it got ridiculous when Trump was like escalating the tariffs with China. You know, it long before they reached their ceiling, it had got to the point where you'd effectively killed the trade anyway. So the EU proposal is reported to be quite similar to the agreement which the USA have just struck with Japan, which I guess means Trump stands a good chance of accepting it. It would be for a mutual tariff waiver on some products such as aircraft and spirits. There'd be a baseline 15% tariff on EU imports into the USA. Now, at one time, that would have been unthinkable for the EU to accept. Of course, they wouldn't accept something like that. But they look like deciding that it's the best they can get. And a trade war not only hampers EU efforts to invest in both defence and green tech, but could risk that solidarity that everyone's worked so hard to build against Russia's invasion plans. It would be an easy sell for Trump back home to most people. Not everyone, I'll come to that. He would be able to say that the EU has accepted above standard baseline tariffs, which he can suggest means that they accept that they have been taking America for a ride, right? And if Trump is happy with the inflationary effects of those tariffs, and the EU can wear it, then, that's what we'll see announced this week, you would think. But there is also a stick behind the EU's offer. Interestingly, it includes the threat of the very first use of what's known as the AntiCoercion Instrument. This is, as the name suggests, designed to prevent coercion of the sort Trump is attempting. If triggered, then not only would the EU unleash its huge counter tariffs, which they've already talked about, but be able to block US services in the EU. Now, it might be targeted at tech companies closest to Trump, but the point is there is already an existing instrument to trigger this countermeasure. So the EU had already pre-planned for this some time ago. Now, look at the fuss Trump is making about digital services tax, which is basically peanuts for the tech giants. Now, imagine his reaction if the EU said, yeah, we're just going to block all US services completely in the EU. Or at least the ones which wouldn't cause political meltdown. And even where services aren't blocked, because, yeah, sure, there are some that the EU wouldn't be able to block, right? Otherwise, they would melt down. It allows the EU to block those companies from public tenders, and it revokes intellectual property protection. Now, that would be huge. So even if a service isn't blocked, it would find itself completely unprotected when operating in the EU. And I saw a suggestion in The Guardian that one expert in the EU has said they think the EU made a mistake in not being open about this threat earlier with the USA. But it may be because it would appear Macron is the only EU leader who had the stomach to really use it now, rather than as a last resort. But it is nonetheless part of the plan B, which the EU seems to be presenting to the US now. Basically, look, we'll accept 15% tariff baseline, some key mutual tariff waivers. You get to talk shit to your supporters and we can basically move on and be friends. Or you can deal with 100 billion euros worth of tariffs on your exports and a full block on a load of services that would make your tech bros piss their pants. The question is, will Trump accept, or are we going to see trade fireworks next month? Well, looking at the reaction to the Japan trade deal, you would think there's a good chance Trump accepts. It's basically the same deal. The Japanese have accepted a 15% baseline tariff, which sounds like a win for Trump, but US car manufacturers are not happy bunnies. Why? After all, it means that there will be way higher tariffs on Japanese imports of cars than at the start of the year, right? Well, Trump's general tariff regime still makes it more expensive to make cars in America because there's 25% tariffs on cars and car parts coming to the USA, except where there's a special arrangement. So Japan will be able to sell, they can make their cars, they can get their components from wherever, no tariffs, right? So they can make their cars, sell them to the USA with a one-time 15% tariff on them, which is not ideal. But American car makers have to pay 25% tariffs on all components imported. And tariffs are an incredibly blunt instrument. They are used sometimes to protect your own industries, but it can go wrong. But only Trump could come up with a tariff system which gives his own domestic production a competitive disadvantage in their own country. You know, he keeps saying things like, oh, you won't be charged tariffs if you produce stuff inside America. Yeah, you are, because you're paying them on in the imports, the components. And this is why Japan presumably accepted the deal. Their cars are going to be less affordable to Americans, right, compared to the start of the year. And America is Japan's biggest export market. It's not great, but relatively speaking, maybe they think they can wear it. Their cars will still be more competitive than Chinese rivals. And the American car industry has now much higher production costs than it did at the start of the year. And this is also why the EU are perhaps prepared to accept the same arrangement as Japan. That although Trump can easily sell it as a good deal to his own supporters, that it's actually such a terrible deal for the USA that we can just ride out the orange storm and get back to a more sensible trade arrangement later on when the USA decides to put an actual government in at some point. But it would have been interesting to see what would have happened if the EU had led with this anti-coercion instrument. I wonder why they didn't do it much earlier. It may have been just as simple as needing to prioritise Trump's support for Ukraine, which is essential for Europe's long-term stability over short-term trade protection. But that appears to be the choice Trump has been presented with. Agree to the same basic arrangement as you did with Japan, or face a nuclear strike on American tech services. Piss off your car makers or piss off your tech bros. Which is it to be? But let me know what you think in the comments below. And for more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching. And until next time, I'll see you later.